The Jets appear to be hunting for their new head coach, and things are taking an interesting turn, with a number of different candidates looking likely and perhaps some intrigue with the Hershey Bears. We'll dive into all of that on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. More than anything, though, we just love and appreciate your support. Like I said, tonight's episode, the Jets are going hunting, and intriguingly, it's about head coaches. Obviously, the roster has a number of changes that the team needs to make, but first and foremost is finding a head coach. That has been one of the biggest challenges. I think if you're the Jets, it's probably the central question for this offseason. Who's going to lead this team forward, right? That is a very difficult thing to answer. And I think if you're looking at Winnipeg's roster and all the other questions that surround it, you're really not going to be able to answer anything until you figure out who's actually leading the team this coming season, because we're really only a few months away from the start of the 24-25 season. And I know that that sounds like a long time when you're thinking about the fact that we're not even to the conference finals this year, but I can tell you time flies by really quickly. And for Winnipeg, all this time where they're without a coach is lost planning time, lost organizational familiarization time. All that kind of stuff is really important when you're trying to bring in somebody new. And I think with the Jets supposedly going through the whole process and really evaluating all of their options, it's really critical that they don't screw this up, which means that they have to get this sorted out as quickly as humanly possible. There's also the reality that there's going to be a lot of head coaches that are going to be fired and brought in to replace them. So in a lot of ways, I think the Jets are probably looking at a tight contested market, but some stuff has been interesting. There have been rumors that there were more than just one interview this past week, which is very cool to hear, I guess. I think for a lot of us, we sort of expected that the Jets might be doing this more as a formality and that Arniel was going to be the guy. But it sounds like that's not really the case, which if you're a Jets fan, that's probably a relieving thought. Not because Arniel is bad necessarily, but because the Jets historically have gone with what you might call the comfortable option. And we'll talk about who they've interviewed and why they might be of interest in just a moment. Before we go any further, though, I did want to shout out our friends and partners and let you know that tonight's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and be sure to use promo code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Stay tuned to hear more about how Game Time can save you time and money on your next event tickets. Now, like I said, obviously, the Jets have gone through a couple of interviews, supposedly. Craig Berube was obviously the one that everyone knew, but I don't think anyone recognized that Dean Evason had also been interviewed. Evason obviously had an interesting tenure with the Wild. When you look at the underlying numbers for his teams, they've generally been middle of the pack. There's nothing that necessarily stands out about them, but you can't say that they're necessarily terrible at anything either. They're just sort of middle of the road, kind of average, not spectacular, not terrible, which I suppose has its own draw in a lot of ways. If you're looking for like a coach who's going to be relatively okay, who's not really going to rock the boat and just gives you relatively clean hockey, I suppose, that's fine. I mean, it's predictable. It's heavy hitting, heavy forechecking, not really flashy. And I think for my take, Evason isn't really that different from Bowness. I think if the Jets really want to move forward, they've probably got to look for a different kind of coach, somebody who sees the game with a more progressive slant, who's a bit younger, and who brings a fresher perspective. Not that Evason would be a terrible choice, but he's pretty far down on my list. I think if you did that route, you might as well just promote Arniel. Speaking of which, Arniel was also apparently on the interview list, which is kind of interesting because obviously he's an internal option. And so I think a lot of folks assumed he would be the guy. He's been sort of I wouldn't say developed necessarily. I think he's been put in line to have the job, but I think with the Jets perhaps looking to make a change and go in a different direction, it's interesting that a number of the players have talked about needing to adjust the way that they do things. The fact that the Jets maybe are catching on with this and that the organization is also thinking the same thing could be a really good sign if you're a Winnipeg fan. I think for a long time, a lot of us have asked the Jets to change their MO. I think a lot of us have felt like Winnipeg has kind of been stuck in the past. Even, in the past couple of years with Bowness, the Jets generally stayed within their comfort zone, right? There wasn't a lot of tremendous innovation and change until recently. And I think that's where there's optimism, right? The Jets have drafted well recently, and they've drafted guys who are seemingly on the cusp of making the NHL, which is interesting because the Jets traditionally haven't drafted and developed all that well, not until the past couple of years. And I don't say that, they don't have players who graduate to the NHL, but generally speaking, they haven't had that many guys make it. Like Dylan Sandberg is probably one of the last big players to really step into a full-time NHL role. And even then, right, he's a really, really good second pairing defender. But, if you're looking past that, right, who else has honestly stepped into the role and been a major role player for this team? It tends to be more depth players and no one really in the top six. I think Perfetti is probably the closest that's come to that that's not named Sandberg. But with Perfetti, obviously the coaching staff hasn't given him the time on ice that he probably deserves. So I can't necessarily count him yet, even though I think he's already very good at the NHL level, and he would be in this conversation if the Jets just used him properly. But that's a question and a discussion for a separate time, and we've already talked about it before. I think the primary point here is that when you look at the roster, not a lot of kids have opportunities to get into the roster and get into the lineup on a routine basis. And so for the veterans to kind of talk about that a little more and perhaps even talk to Chevy about it is interesting. That's a change, and that means that you kind of have to have a coach who's willing to play those kids, and that's where I continue to be interested in Todd Nelson. Now, one of the things that came out of Elliot Friedman's podcast, who mentioned these interviews, he also said that the Jets might be waiting to make a decision until Todd Nelson's season is over. They really want to speak to him, it sounds like, which to me tells me that there's a lot more interest in Nelson than just doing a formal interview, right? They might really view him as a guy who might be able to work with the young Jets, who might be able to bring, a level of tactical savvy and experience to this team. And look, his NHL record is very short. He doesn't really have much of anything to go off of right now, but at all the other levels that he's coached, he's generally been very successful. And so for me, I'm willing to take that punt in part because it's not like the competitors he's dealing with are really that much better. We know what Evason and Berube and Keefe and some of these other guys are. We don't really know what Todd Nelson is. And Nelson might be the kind of coach that this team needs to start to grow this franchise over the next few years. I think Bowness did a fantastic job of stabilizing a really garbage situation and cleaning up a room that was super toxic. But now it's time to, I would say, take the next step and move forward. And that's where, you need the right coach for that. And maybe Nelson's it. But until his season is over with the Hershey Bears, they're not going to have that chance to find out. So something to keep in mind, but it is exciting, I guess. It's different. I think that is perhaps the biggest takeaway that I have is we're talking about a coach that the Jets in the past would never have given the time of day. So I'm excited about it. I feel like maybe there's a real process here, and it's not just lip service, which, hey, if the Jets are willing to put their money where their mouth is, I think that is all the better for us as fans. What isn't going to make fans happy is what happens with Brenden Dillon. And there was an announcement from Scott McIntyre about not Scott McIntyre, apologies. Gosh, I don't know why I'm blanking on his name. Scott, you know who I'm talking about. He was looking into some quotes and stuff around Brenden Dillon and has heard that the camp has not really received any communication from the Jets. We'll talk about that and what that sort of means for his spot and what it might mean for Winnipeg's defense in just a little bit. Before we go too much further, though, obviously, We've got lots of friends and partners that we always talk about, and one of the ones that I think is really worth spotlighting is our friends at Indeed. When it comes to building a top-end roster, you need to have a top-end recruiter, and that's where Indeed can help you build your fantasy team. Indeed is the hiring platform where you can attract, interview, and hire all in one place. Don't spend hours on multiple job sites hunting for candidates who might not actually fit what you need with your must-have job requirements. Use Indeed because they can help you find top talent fast, and based on their data, 80% of Indeed employers find quality candidates whose resume on Indeed matches their must-have requirements the moment they sponsor a job. As somebody who has actually used Indeed when I was looking for work, I can personally attest to the fact that it is a great service. I think it's very informative. It's step-by-step. It helps guide you through the process, and it's very detailed. So you're not just getting junk applications, right? You're getting real candidates who really want your job and who actually provide the right skill sets that match what you're needing. And Indeed doesn't want you to waste time and money. You only pay for the applications that match your must-have requirements, or you don't pay at all, right? It's very simple, and over 3 million businesses already use Indeed, so why not become one of them? They're a great platform, very flexible, and they know that time is money. So if you want to get started, obviously, there is a great option here. We have a special offer for you. Indeed knows that when you're growing your own business, obviously, it's important to make every dollar count. And that's why when you visit Indeed.com/lockedon, you can get a great job credit. This is a great time to help give yourself a little bit of a boost. Obviously, this is a great time to hire new employees, and I highly recommend that you use Indeed. So just go to Indeed.com/lockedon to get started right now. That's Indeed.com/lockedon. Terms and conditions apply. Cost per application pricing is not available for everyone. Need to hire? You need Indeed. Hey friends, and welcome back to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Everydayers, thank you so much for joining us on tonight's episode as we are just talking about some off-season stuff. And obviously the Jets are looking for a head coach primarily, but they're also going to need to find another left defender because it sounds like Brenden Dillon is not coming back. Now, here's the thing about Dillon, right? I like him a lot. I think he's a very good player, and he's been better for the Jets than I think a lot of us expected. When he was acquired from the Caps for 2 second-rounders, the first thought was, wow, that's a little pricey. And the second thought was, is he really going to shape the destiny of this team and move it forward? And I don't know that the answer at the time was very clear. It wasn't even clear until the past year or two where his role with the team really crystallized into great defender status. And it wasn't like he was bad at defending or anything before. He was just not quite at the level of providing as much support as he has when he's in possession of the puck as he has this year. Like, this has been a career season from him. He's been great in both ends of the ice, and really the growth in this game has been, very fun to watch, which means he's going to need a bit of an extension. And if you're the Jets, let's be real, right? Your left side on your defense is probably one of the few where organizationally you've got options. If Dillon was on the right side, we'd be having a very different conversation. But Brenden is a left defender, and as such, he's not a guy who really plays on the right side. Because he doesn't really play as offhand, he's not really somebody that I think the Jets are keen to go crazy for. I think they really like Brenden, and I think in a lot of ways, in a different time and place, they would have already offered him a contract. But I think given where the Jets roster is, what their needs are, the salary cap situation, and the fact that Heinola is waiting for his chance to actually get an NHL spot and looked like he was already on pace to earn it last season, I think it just naturally aligns with the thought that Dillon's probably going to be let go to test the market. And I think that actually makes sense for everyone involved. I love Brenden. He's a great player. I think his personality has been perfect for the Jets, but he needs a big raise, and I don't think the Jets are the team that can really offer it. I think they could fit it if they made it work, but I just don't think it makes a lot of sense. I think Winnipeg should be more focused on giving Sandberg that spot. I think Dillon has proven beyond a reasonable doubt that he's ready for it, and I think he can become one of our, best internally developed defenders since Morrissey. We don't really have many Jets blue line prospects that have ever made the big jump and become minute-munching defenders. We just don't have that. Not since Josh. We really haven't had anyone who could do it. I mean, Kovacevic obviously is doing it for the Habs, but that's Montreal. That's not Winnipeg. So in terms of players who have stepped into a full-time D role for the Jets, we don't really have anyone. And that's where Samberg, I think, has been a really big breath of fresh air, because not only has he stepped into that role, but he's also just been really dang good. So I don't want to say that there's no place for Dillon, but I think he's kind of a luxury sort of player. And given that the Jets need to open up left side defender spots and that the cap situation is a very real concern, I hate to say it, but I think Brendan's probably on the outs, and there's probably a clear reason why he's not been made a priority in their list of signings. Now, it's not inconceivable that they come to an agreement later, but if you're asking me right now, based on what I see with this team and what the organization is signaling, I don't think Brendan's coming back. I do think that what Scott said earlier, from his sources saying it's probably a very slim chance he returns, is the most likely outcome. There are tons of teams out there who are going to absolutely go bananas the moment Dillon hits the free agency market, because he's actually really friggin' good. And he offered some legit offensive support this year. There's just not many left-sided defenders like that who are strong, physical, and actually defend really well while also not being an absolute slug in the offensive zone. That was actually, funny enough, that was kind of his reputation before, and it was kind of why I didn't really feel like I liked the initial fit when we acquired him, but he's really grown in his role. But obviously at his age, he doesn't have a ton of big years left. And I think if you're banking on him doing what he did this season in the following years, probably not super likely. So again, I think he's a great player. I like him a lot. I think that in terms of what his fit would have been like several years ago, I would have had zero question about extending him. But where the Jets are now and what they need, they have to give spots to kids. They really need to have them grow into roles. And I think next season needs to be the year that Heinola finally makes it. At this point, I don't even know what his actual ceiling is, because, his trajectory and development course has kind of been a little bit helter-skelter. But, given that he almost earned a spot out of camp this year until he broke his ankle, I feel good about him being a really solid number 4 or number 5 defender. I think he's going to offer some really good versatility and puck moving ability, and Samberg is ready to take on Dillon's role. So stuff to think about, but kind of on that same notion, I wanted to talk about the Jets reshuffling the defense, because there may be other stuff that they have to do, especially on the right side. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. Before we get too much further, though, I did want to shout out our friends and partners that I mentioned earlier at Game Time. Obviously, a lot of you have probably purchased tickets, whether it's hockey tickets or concert tickets or whatever. You know how it is. It's always a surprise when you get hit with surprise charges and fees. You pay out the wazoo, and sometimes you're not even sure where you're sitting. Game Time gets it. They know you're paying. They hate it too. They're customers of other services just like yourself, and they get it, right? It sucks when you get hit with all this stuff. You don't get all-in pricing, and you know what? No one wants to be blindsided, and Game Time is here to help. Not only do they offer all-in pricing, but they also offer you in-seat view, so you actually know what you're paying for. And best of all, the closer you get to, tip-off or first pitch, whether you're in the NBA or MLB, official partners, by the way, of Game Time's marketplace, you actually save money because the prices go down. With killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, flash sales, zone deals, event cancellation protection, you name it, Game Time really is the best option. So if you want to take the guesswork out of buying tickets, go with Game Time. Download the app, create an account, and be sure to use promo code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download the Game Time app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Hey friends, and welcome back to these closing thoughts on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day. Everydayers, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode, as we're just wrapping up with some thoughts on the Jets needing to reorganize the defense. Obviously, Winnipeg has made some big changes, most notably Rick Bowness retiring, which suddenly casts a huge question mark on the rest of the team. But with the announcement that Brenden Dillon is likely not returning, and the Jets needing to do something with either a Pionk or Schmidt, Winnipeg's defense is going to have a big shuffle next year, and I think that's all for the better. Winnipeg's defense has traditionally been on the slower side and more physical and heavy, which is fine, but it just means that you're going to have trouble against speed and skill, and that's where, unfortunately, I think Winnipeg got carved up by the Avs, who, by the way, have clawed back a game against the Stars. So don't count them out yet. They're still in the series. We'll talk about that on tomorrow's episode. But focusing on the Jets' defense, obviously, talking about the Avs, right? The Jets don't really have a Makar. They've got a Morrissey who is almost there at that level when Makar is at his best. Maybe not 100%, but really friggin' close. I think Morrissey's even better defensively, even if you do trade some of the offense with that. All that said, Josh is clearly like a franchise-level defender. After him, you find out that there's not much else. And so I think for the Jets, it's really critical that they get faster and more mobile on the back end. You saw this year that zone exits were a problem again. Under pressure, the Jets defenders also coughed at the puck a lot. They either passed it into opposing skaters or they just really fumbled it, and sometimes it ended up in the back of their net. So the Jets need to be choosy and careful how they do this. Obviously, I think Heinel is going to be a big boost, and I think Sandberg is capable of doing the same job that Dillon did. But on the right side, you really have to figure out how to get that blue line to be more mobile. And as much as I like Salamonson, I just don't think asking him to immediately step into like a big role with the Jets, even on the third pairing, is really a fair assessment. I think you want to see what he does in preseason, and if he thrives and looks good, I'm willing to have that conversation, maybe even alongside Heinel or something. But I think at this point, the Jets probably need to make a trade. And with Ehlers being floated out there, which we'll also talk about on a future episode, as much as I like Ehlers, I don't think he's going to bring back a big trade piece unless it's part of a package. And if you trade him, you better get like a big right-handed D for the top four, because I think at this point, that's one of Winnipeg's biggest needs. Obviously, the center depth is another problem, and with Ehlers gone, the wing depth is also going to take a hit. So it just seems like you're darned if you do and darned if you don't. But I think for the Jets, finding a big puck-moving blue liner is a big, big question mark. But I do think Jacob Chychrun might be an answer if you're looking for an option that may not blow your budget completely apart. Chychrun hasn't really been crazy good for the Sens, but he's shown promise, and I think that's where you sort of have to project and bank on him recovering his form for the Jets. I think he's still really good, and I think you could get him at a price that may not be insanity, right? You're still going to have to pay a fair bit for a right-handed top four defender, but maybe not as much as like a franchise-level guy. And if you can perhaps move one of Schmidt or Pionk in the deal, maybe it somehow works out, right? Now, of course, the package would have to be sizable because, let's be real, right? The Sens probably know Neal and Schmidt are not what they once were. And given the salary cap hits for both guys, they're not cheap. And I think the Sens are trying to compete. So I don't know if that deal necessarily makes sense for both parties. I think for the Jets, surely it does, but maybe Ottawa feels differently. I don't know what the Sens' plan is. It's hard to get a read on that. Hiring Travis Green doesn't really tell me much of anything other than that maybe they're just a little bit desperate for somebody to try and stabilize that team. Maybe actually a guy like Schmidt would be perfect for them because he brings veteran experience. He's still pretty okay at what he does, even if he's lost a step. And in terms of like a warm personality that can basically make a room feel lighter given the circumstances, maybe he actually makes more sense than it appears. And of course, he's not the main piece at all. He'd be more of like an ancillary thing. But if you're talking about swapping Chychrun for Schmidt, at least on paper, just for a one-for-one roster change, that could make sense. Obviously, you need to throw in like picks or prospects and stuff to balance it out so that it's a little more fair for Ottawa. But, in terms of the Jets upgrading the right side, maybe they could do that. And if you slide Pionk into a third pairing role, which is unlikely, but, potential, I think that could give Winnipeg a real big boost. DeMello taking less minutes would certainly be, I think, a blessing for him. He's still really good, but he is slowing down and you notice it. So the less work that he has to do and where he can sort of be a more supporting guy instead of, your top pair with Morrissey, it might help out everyone involved, right? I think DeMello is still capable of doing it in spurts, maybe just not wise to ask him to do it as much as he did the past couple of seasons. So something to keep an eye on. But for the Jets, This is a critical offseason and a big chance for them to reformat their entire defense. Let's just hope that they take that opportunity and make the most of it, because it could shape the destiny of this team going forward. But obviously that is a topic for another time. We'll talk more about that throughout the offseason. And, as the Jets start getting linked up guys, we'll continue to talk about those trade rumors. But for tonight's episode, though, that's going to be all the time that we have. I thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. We'll see you back here later, so be sure to like, follow, and subscribe. And as always, go Jets, go.